Mm, 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 mm. Good morning, y'all. Welcome back from the break. Do you guys have a good break? Okay. Informal quiz, or informal poll here, non-scientific poll. How many of you guys feel more rested now than before the break? Okay. How many of you guys feel more tired now than before the break? Mm-hmm. I love taking this poll. There's always a pretty big split. So, Grace, you like to stay up late at night? Yeah, me too. I'm going to wait just a little bit longer for a couple other people to join. This week is actually kind of a momentous week, politically speaking. In fact, today and tomorrow are kind of bellwether days. All right, people are joining in. That's good to see. Nice to see so many faces too. I really appreciate that. So today is the runoff election in Georgia, and that is going to determine who has the balance of power in the Senate. So there are two senators running in Georgia, and rarely do two senators from one state happen to be running in the same year. It's happening because one senator was appointed, and when you get appointed to run, then you have to run to become legitimate at the next 2-year period. And the other one is just up for reelection. But to have two senators in one state is very unusual. And in Georgia, their state law, and remember, states control the election, their state law says that if nobody receives more than 50% of the vote, then they have a runoff. And that's what happened in the November election. None of the candidates got more than 50%. And so you have two Republicans and two Democrats running for Senate. And right now, the number in the Senate is 50 Republicans to 48 Democrats. So it could either turn out to be 52 Republicans to 48 Democrats, or 58 to 49, or what Democrats are hoping for, 50 to 50. In which case, see if any of you guys know, if it's a 50-50 split between Republicans and Democrats, who's the tiebreaker?
Isn't it the vice president?
It is indeed. It's the vice president. The vice president is basically the president of the Senate. And so he becomes the 51st vote. So if it's a 50-50 split, then by that margin, the fact that Kamala Harris is going to be the new vice president, she'll be the 51st Democrat vote. So this is a big deal. I mean, it actually is a big deal, because if the Democrats manage to win these two votes, they have control of both houses of Congress by very, very paper thin margins. If the Republicans win, then it's a split in the houses of Congress, and it will be less easy for President Biden to get his agenda. So this is a big deal election. Also, are you aware of what's happening tomorrow? Anybody? Okay. So let me tell you. All of the convoluted steps involved in the Electoral College, this is the final one. So the first one was, of course, the election, and then states certifying their own election results, which gives their electoral votes to one candidate or the other. And then there is, in December, a day when all of the states actually certify their electoral candidate votes. So the states have said we counted and recounted our votes. We've done the audits. We certify that this person has won, either Joe Biden or President Trump. And therefore, our electoral votes are going to go now to Congress to be officially counted. Tomorrow is the day when they get officially counted. And normally this day, in almost every other election, it's a very ceremonial thing. The vice president basically cuts open the envelopes from the states, and then he hands them to somebody, and somebody announces that Missouri's electoral votes go for blah, and Michigan's electoral votes go for blah, and they add it all up, and then they certify what we all know, is that Joe Biden will win with 306 electoral votes. However, there is an 1887 law, because there was a kerfuffle that year. Congress passed a new law that said that if anybody wants to object to a certain state's electors, or they don't trust the count, they can challenge it. And if there's somebody who will challenge it from the Senate and from the House of Representatives, then they go trotting off to their own chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they debate what the challenge is about for up to 2 hours. And this may go on longer than 2 hours. And then they hold a vote as to whether they're going to certify the vote. And in order to not certify it, it would take a majority in both houses to say, we don't accept it. And that's if there was just a massive mess up. It's looking very, very likely, because at least 12 senators and a whole gaggle of Republicans in the House of Representatives have said they will challenge this. And so it's challenge the irregularities, which have been thrown out of court almost 60 times, involving, as I read this morning, involving over 90 judges appointed by both parties. In fact, a good number of judges appointed by President Trump himself. They've thrown every one of these cases out. But because politicians are politicians, and they're looking for popular support themselves, because politicians are people with ambition. These Republicans are going to challenge it to look loyal to the voters of President Trump, and they will lose their challenges. Every conservative, progressive, editorialist, writer, journalist I've read has said it's guaranteed to fail, but they're doing it anyways, just so that they can look like they were loyal supporters to the very end. The problem is that what it does is it stokes distrust in the system. And this is, democracy is a faith-based system. You have to believe in the results. Otherwise, you have social chaos. And so, as I was reading this morning, there's a very conservative columnist, George Will, who is even older than me, but he and I agree on very few things. But in this, George Will is absolutely pissed at the Republicans that are challenging him. He calls them children. And because he says they're threatening the Constitution. He said they are right now the Constitution's most serious domestic threat. And he's talking about Republican senators and representatives. And this is a lifelong Republican saying this. So anyway, tomorrow is going to be high farce in Washington, D.C. And so after I get done with Ohana and my school responsibilities, I am totally going to tune in and find out how this is going to go, because it's splitting the Republican Party in a pretty dramatic way. And the leadership of the party is very against all of this, but these are people that have presidential ambitions. And so it's going to be interesting to watch. Like I say, it's going to be high drama, kind of like a farce, though, because it's all pretend, because none of it's going to stand in the end. And on January 20th, we will have a new president. So yeah, it's fun to see how this stuff all rolls out. And 1,000 people are still dying from COVID each day. Yes, thank you, Grace. Yeah, and Governor Brown, our own governor, says she is angry at the Oregon Health Authority for getting vaccinations out as slowly as they are. She wants them up to 12,000 a day. And I've heard nothing personally about when teachers might be getting these. So I'm not holding any hope that we're going to be back in a school building this year. Next year for sure, but I'm not holding any hope for this year. So anyway, this week is actually going to be a dramatic week. Stay tuned. Of course, when we meet again on Friday, all of this will have happened, and then I can tell you how it all rolled out. So today, in the spirit of protest, but useful protest, not silly protest, you remember the things that we were doing before the break had to do with civil disobedience and its logic and its problems. And I wanted to show you today, today and Friday, we're going to spend also on the same subject. Today, I'm going to show you several videos that show how civil disobedience has been a positive force, actually, in society. I want to reflect for a moment. The last homework assignment that some of you did had to do with situations whether civil disobedience is justified or not. And one of the things that I want to clarify for you, when laws are passed, generally they need to be obeyed. Nobody wants to get pulled over and given a massive ticket, or worse, hauled into jail for a silly or transient reason. I mean, we're not talking about being a burglar here. We're talking about taking a principled stand on something. Laws need to be understood and obeyed, unless a law is tragically wrong. It wasn't long ago before it was more or less illegal to be gay. If you were discovered to be homosexual in the 1970s or the 1960s, or even up into the 80s, you could lose your job. You could get kicked out of your apartment, and that you had no legal recourse. There was no law to turn to that says that I'm being discriminated against. You could be discriminated against quite legally. It was up until 1967 that interracial marriage was illegal in many states, right? It took a protest. It took a couple in Virginia with the awesome name of Loving, was the last name, to take that to the Supreme Court. In Virginia, a black man and a white woman got married, knowing that they were breaking Virginia law. And when the police came in and said, you can't live together, they took it to court, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court tossed out the law that said they could not be married, right? So sometimes you take a principled stand to challenge a law. And so I'm going to show you some videos today that sort of reflect on that principle. The one thing that I want to emphasize with this is that I am not teaching you guys to be scofflaws. I am not teaching you to disrespect the law. If you do things like this because you feel a principled reason in the future, you do it because it is principled, and because you are knowledgeable about the law, and you are strategic, and you are intelligent, and you are purposeful, and you're doing it with other people. You're doing it together. And that's what the videos I'm going to show you have to do with. And I'm going to start off. You guys have all heard of Gandhi, right? Yes, Zane. Yes, please be informed citizens. You guys all know of Gandhi, right? Gandhi also knew of civil disobedience. He read it. Um, I'm going to show. Have any of you guys seen the movie Gandhi? Came out what 20 years ago. Won a whole bunch of Academy Awards. Okay, I'm going to just put it. It's. I'm sure it's streaming on several services. It's an excellent movie, actually. Gandhi had no elected power. Gandhi was in command of no armies. He just had a philosophy, a nonviolent philosophy, and that nonviolent philosophy basically, over time, forced the British out of India. And the clip I'm going to show you from the movie has to do with the salt law that the British passed. When you're an imperial force, when you've colonized a country, you've done it in order to enrich yourself. And the British passed a law saying that you could not harvest or sell salt yourself. You had to buy it from a British supplier. Like the entire country of India had to have salt bought from a British supplier, of course, to enrich Britain. And Gandhi said, that's ridiculous. Salt is essential. You need salt to live. We're not going to obey that law. And so that's what this is. And then he came up with an idea of the March to the Sea, which was sort of his opening salvo against the British, basically saying, I devil dog dare you to stop me. And he'll articulate in here, there's one character that's a journalist. And the journalist is essential in this story because they're the ones that carry the eyewitness to the rest of the world. And so he explains his philosophy to this journalist. So let me show this to you. So the Salt March, which became famous. And so this is Gandhi, and everyone in the room right here becomes a future leader of either India or Pakistan.
It's gone beyond remedies like passive resistance. If I may, I, for one, have never advocated passive anything. I'm with Mr. Jinnah. We must never submit to such laws. Ever. And I think our resistance must be active and provocative.
That act, what he's doing right there is he's taking the tray from a servant. We're in India here where they have a caste society. So people are from different castes. And in Hindu theology, that's how you're born. All the men in the room are of the Brahmin caste, which is the top level, and the man who is the servant is from a lower caste. And for Gandhi to take the tray from him and do his job for him is Gandhi's way of illustrating that this whole class-based system is part of what Britain is taking advantage of. And so he's actually kind of against that in a way.
I want to embarrass all those who wish to treat us as slaves. Thank you. Forgive my stupid illustration. Allow me. No, please. But I want to change their minds. Not kill them for weaknesses we all possess. And what resistance would you offer? The law is due to take effect from April the 6th. I want to call upon the nation to make that a day of prayer and fasting. You mean a general strike? I mean a day of prayer and fasting. Of course, no work could be done, no buses, no trains, no factories, no administration. The country would stop. God, it would terrify them. What I would like to do is to come to some compromise over the new
If you would
civil
excuse me, Your Excellency, it is our view that matters have gone beyond legislation. We think it is time you recognized that you are masters in someone else's home. Despite the best intentions of the best of you, you must, in the nature of things, humiliate us to control us.
You don't think we're just going to walk out of India?
Yes. In the end, you will walk out. Because 100,000 Englishmen simply cannot control 350 million Indians if those Indians refuse to cooperate. And that is what we intend to achieve. Peaceful, non-violent, non-cooperation. Till you yourself see the wisdom of leaving, Your Excellency.
Wait a minute. You know what you're going to do, don't you?
It would have been very uncivil of me to let you make such a long trip for nothing.
He's the journalist, writes for the New York Times. He's the essential other character in this strategy.
Where you going? Come. Where are we going?
I'm going back to the ashram, and I'm going to prove to the new viceroy that the king's writ no longer runs in India.
Salt? Yes, sir. He's going to march to the sea and make salt.
Mr. Gandhi will find it takes a great deal more than a pinch of salt to bring down the British Empire.
Is it all over if they arrest you now?
Not if they arrest me or 1,000 or 10,000. It's not only generals who know how to plan campaigns.
What if they don't arrest you? What if they don't react at all?
Here's the important point.
Your notebook. The function of a civil resistor is to provoke response. And we will continue to provoke until they respond or they change the law. They are not in control. We are. That is the strength of civil resistance.
What he did right there was illegal. And he's double dogging the British. He's daring them to do something about it.
Men need salt as he needs air and water. This salt comes from the Indian Ocean. Let every Indian claim it as his right.
And so, once more, the man of non-violence has challenged the might of the British Empire.
It's gone beyond
Whoop.
remedies.
So, that's in India. People in America were watching what was happening in India. We have our own traditions as well, but seeing how effective Gandhi used it, especially the nonviolent, non-cooperation. Martin Luther King was watching that very carefully. On Friday, we're going to read his letter from a Birmingham jail, which is the clearest description I can think of what this philosophy is about. But to step forward a little bit in our time, you guys have all heard of the lunch counter protests, right? That took place in the South? Nope. Okay. In the Jim Crow era, if you're in my history class, you will get plenty of this. But in the Jim Crow era in the South, it was illegal for African Americans to eat at most lunch counters. You could buy, and they particularly aimed at Woolworths, which doesn't exist anymore, but was a big chain when I was growing up. They call it the Five and Dime. It's like the dollar store, except much bigger. And they had a lunch counter. And so African Americans could go there to buy things, and they did because things were inexpensive, but you couldn't work there. There was no management or workers that were African American, and you could not sit at the lunch counter by law. And so they challenged this as a way to desegregate the downtowns of southern states. And so they planned very, very carefully. And this became something that spread across the southern cities, where African Americans would come and sit at the lunch counters. And it was, again, it was strategic, it was planned, it was carefully thought through. And what I'm going to show you right now is a video, just a short segment of a training session that was done in Nashville, led by a man named John Lawson, who African-American minister, who said, you don't just go in and sit down and go in unprepared. You have to know what you're going to face. And so he's getting his people ready, his protesters ready for what is actually going to happen. He's training them to be nonviolent when they are being provoked in a way that normally would provoke a violent reaction. And he knows, he said, the minute you swing back, we've lost. You cannot swing back. You have to just take it. Because when the world is witnessing, they're going to see who's swinging the fist and who is not. And that's what's going to change people's minds. Little trigger warning, in this training, you will hear them using the N-word. Okay, but understand the context in which it's being used. Okay, so just to put that down carefully. John Los Angeles. Called March. So the graphic novel, Grace, is called March?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And you can check out what Grace put in the chat. That's good to know. So I'm going to make sure this video is up and ready. Okay, here we go.
Tim, if I was being beat, what is it that I would be able to do?
We said we were going to desegregate downtown Nashville. Our first step was going to be desegregate lunch counters and restaurants. That, of course, was the first Gandhian step. That was the first step of nonviolence. To research and examine and focus on an issue. Choose a target, choose an issue.
Now, let's see.
Months before going to the lunchrooms, Lawson begins preparing them.
A bunch of niggers. Well, look at the 8 balls all lined up.
Hi there, Jungle Bunny.
He's so dark, he's making the whole place dark.
He wants them to have experienced both physical and verbal attacks, and to learn how to resist the impulse to run or fight back.
That was pretty good. How about that?
Now let's see what we've learned from this to us as to how we might act non-violently. What are the basic problems here so far?
You cannot go on a demonstration with 25 people doing whatever they want to do. They have to have a common discipline. And that's a key word for me, that the difficulty with nonviolent people and efforts is that they don't recognize the necessity of fierce discipline and training and strategizing and planning and recruiting and doing the kinds of things that you to have a movement. That can't happen spontaneously. It has to be done systematically.
As the man said. Systematically, yes, and programmatically. So, oh, Allison, no problem. So, yeah, that is the important part to remember, and it is one of the parts that, as much as you might have supported or not supported the protest this summer, one of the issues was that it certainly wasn't disciplined, and there was plenty of acting out in a violent way, which can be understandable. But if you're trying to move a political point forward, you lose support when you do that. And you can see that the protests became a campaign point for people that opposed the protests. They used that violence as their own campaign slogan. So the discipline is something that's really important to keep in mind here. It's not a spontaneous acting out. I'm going to show you another thing about the sit-ins. Eventually, these worked. They desegregated downtowns because what happens is when you do these protests, it's not just the police who show up, the press shows up. And it was the TV and the reporters that were there that showed it to the entire rest of the country that brought political pressure to bear and changed the laws. So let me show you that.
Let us break.
So this is taking place, what they're showing here took place in Mississippi, which was one of the later ones. But it shows how they had to organize and how they had to stick together in this.
Together on our knees. Let us break bread together on our knees. Let us fall on our knees, turn our face to the rising sun, crying, Lord, have mercy, if you please. The breaking of bread, the coming together. You even feed your enemy.
The South was completely segregated. Black and white lived in separate worlds.
People can hardly imagine now that there were signs up showing colored waiting room was this way and the white waiting room is over here.
These people just cannot in their heads come to understand that not only do we look like you, walk like you, talk like you, we're human like you.
Jackson was really behind what was happening in the other southern states.
Jackson, Mississippi.
Now, I had been very good at memorizing all the Bible verses. A lot of the ones we were given were how to live, like love thy neighbor as thyself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But clearly, we weren't doing it. We were a bunch of hypocrites. We needed to change.
There were several grades of activists back then. I mean, you had like the street level, and then you had people in institutions of higher learning.
Tougaloo was dedicated to not just educating, but also what seems to me an experiment in democracy.
You had faculty like John Salter. He challenged his students to think about what are some of the social problems that we must contend with. How are you going to change them?
We decided we would do the sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter.
Now, Woolworth was what we called a five and dime. Think dollar store with a food court.
They sold hot dogs and hamburgers.
Everyone shopped at a five and dime. Everyone could afford it. And to not be welcomed as a customer at this one part of the store, the lunch counter, that was morally and legally indefensible. Ann Moody, Perlina, and Memphis Norman, all of whom were Tougaloo students, were going to sit at the counter. And then there was going to be a diversionary sort of picket line down the street.
That's the strategy. Talk about how they had layers of strategy here.
Idea, I think, being that the picket line would divert the police attention while people got seated.
They would be a decoy. they became the most photographed sit-in in the history of the sit-in movement.
Lois Chafee, who was a house mother, though she was only a year or two older than us at most, she and I were going to be the spotters for the picket line. We would call back to Medgar Evers' office and give a report periodically. Well, the picket line got arrested right away, so we decided we'd just go down and see what was happening. And basically what was happening was all hell was breaking loose.
This was the lunch hour. So students at Central High School had a lunch break, and it was just a few blocks away, so they walked over. This is a very conflicting scene.
I conferred with Ed King, who was the spotter, about should I sit down? And yes, I should. And then Annie and I got pulled off our stools and drug up to the front of the store.
It was very theatrical.
The main weapons were whatever was sitting on the counter. And I mean, this is everything from vinegar to pepper to sugar to sometimes a fist.
At the end of the day, it's about humiliating people. It's to bring a person to their knees psychologically.
Okay, look at the faces of especially the men in that crowd. And that's why John Lawson had his people, and these people had to do the same. That's why you have to prepare and get yourself ready for this, because just look at the hatred in those faces.
The Supreme Court had ruled, I think the week before, that the police of their own initiative could not come into a store to make arrests. The store had to be closed by the manager, and they thought this was just real funny, these police did.
Memphis Norman was thrown to the floor, kicked, beaten, unconscious, blood coming out his nose, mouth. Medgar said, well, should we call it off?
We were committed to sitting there. When it got really looking like we might not make it out of there, I had sort of an out-of-body experience. Your real self just sort of leaves, departs. Surreal, you might say, but I think it's survival. And at that point, survival was in doubt, yeah.
The pictures were shown around the world.
There you go.
By the next day, there are people volunteering, ready to do things. Suddenly we were visible.
I mean, this is not to take away from King, but to reduce the civil rights movement to Rosa Parks and Dr. King makes everyday folks like you and me look like we can't do anything except follow. The students today have to see
That's you.
that they can identify their cause and go change the world. And us old folks, now our role is to have their back.
That's me. So you can see the preparation that was absolutely necessary for those people to train their brains not to swing back. Because really the weapon that had at their disposal was the fact that those photographs and those images went out, and the next day suddenly everybody was aware, and now they had even more people willing to help. And that awareness is what moved the goalpost. That's what changed things, is everybody gets to see what's really happening. You make the injustice visible, the most important part.
I also feel like it's got to be inspiring. Like when you're the brave one to start it off, then other people will see and they'll start their own protests.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's easy. Yeah, it's a good point. And it's easy if it's not in your face and it doesn't really personally affect you. It's easy to just get on with your life and not really, because it's going to take energy away. It could be frightening. it's easy to ignore if it doesn't personally affect you, right? And it's when it raised the level of visibility to the point where you couldn't ignore it anymore, and it preys on your conscience. And that's the point, is to get it to that level. Otherwise, I mean, Jim Crow laws lasted basically from 1880 right up to 1964, which is in my lifetime. And it wasn't until strategies were developed and honestly, the United States had developed enough of a sort of a collective consciousness to say this is wrong, to actually force change. Because otherwise it's just too easy to, if it's not my problem. And so you have to kind of make it other people's problem. I'm going to ask you guys a question. I'm going to share something with you. Have you seen this anywhere? Have you seen posters or signs in windows or images of these fists anywhere? And the answer is yes. I was guessing most of you had. So, not that it's was done by one person specifically, it's kind of a universal symbol, but there is one case very specifically where raised fists, and some of those actually recall those, is the 1968 Olympics, where two African-American athletes in Mexico City, that's where the Summer Olympics were held that year, raised their fists when they were on the medal stand, and it caused a huge kerfuffle. So did any of you know that story? This is, your grandparents' lifetime. So let me show it to you, and let me show, so you become familiar with the two individuals that did it, but also they were part of a movement, and then what happened to them many years later because of it. So here is the fist. All right, come on. Excuse me 1 second, it's arguing with me. I have to get it ready ahead of time, I guess. Okay, we're all set now.
The 1968 U.S. Olympic track and field team is considered one of the greatest ever assembled to represent the U.S. in the Olympics. They won 28 medals and set 8 world records at the Games in Mexico City. The team included some of the fastest runners in the world at the time, like sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who made history when they accepted their medals and then raised their fists during the playing of the U.S. national anthem in a protest full of symbolism. And they almost didn't even show up that year.
Black men and women athletes have unanimously voted to fully endorse and participate in a boycott of the World Olympic Games in 1968.
Members of the team threatened to stay home in protest of racist treatment of black athletes in America.
They will not participate in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City unless something is done about these terrible evils and injustices.
So that in case our black boys don't want to go,
what would they have to do for you to go to Mexico?
Boycott is still on.
The story of this silent protest and the boycott that almost was starts with the buttons all 3 medal winners wore that day, the Olympic Project for Human Rights.
Sorry about this.
Susan?
Oh, I'm looking for coupon codes.
Well, Capital One Shopping instantly searches for available coupon codes and automatically applies them.
Save me some cheddar.
Capital One Shopping. It's kind of genius. What's in your wallet?
Ouch.
The Olympic Project for Human Rights, or OPHR, was founded in 1967 by sociologist, educator, and former star athlete Dr. Harry Edwards. It was a coalition of prominent Olympic athletes that threatened to derail American Olympic glory by opting out of the Games, to protest the racism in sports that, for decades, had gone unaddressed. In the mid-20th century, sports seemed to be a leading example of improved racial equality in the United States. Black athletes like football player Kenny Washington and baseball player Jackie Robinson broke racial barriers by joining professional leagues in 1946 and 1947, which until that point had been whites only. College and professional sports teams gradually integrated from there, years ahead of racial segregation legally ending in the United States.
So the media began to promote the black athlete as a symbol that racial democracy existed in the United States. If Jackie Robinson can make it, then why can't other blacks make it? And so it was kind of a factor that was used to dismiss the question of institutionalized racism.
But in the 1960s, the myth of racial progress in America began to dissolve. The Civil Rights Act ended legal segregation in 1964, but Black Americans continued to face institutionalized racism and police brutality.
Integration simply wasn't successful in terms of improving Black people's lives, and you needed to force further change.
Years of frustration ultimately erupted in widespread violent riots.
I think the further we get away from it, we underestimate the influence of the riots. The riots happened in a lot of urban cities across America. Black people still live in terrible socioeconomic conditions in the cities, and that was just as much a problem as Jim Crow laws. So how do you attract attention to that?
A growing Black Power movement and Black student movement in the 1960s emboldened Black athletes to speak up about the racial injustices they endured off the field.
There's no difference between a Black and a white athlete. We're all out there sweating, we run on two legs. But it's a difference in the way society treats us after we leave the track.
But with the 1968 Olympics coming up, Black athletes saw an opportunity to push for change.
The idea of a Black Olympic boycott has been around since 1959, and it went through various fits and stops until you get to the Black Power Conference in 1967. And the Black Power Conference basically argued that you should use any means possible to force the government to pay attention to institutionalized racism.
For Harry Edwards, that meant organizing the Olympic Project for Human Rights.
I think one of those means that are necessary right now is the Olympic boycott movement and the whole revolt of the Black athlete in this country.
He realized that he could use Black sports participation as a way to attract attention to the problem.
The OPHR had 5 key demands, among them being to disinvite South Africa and Rhodesia, 2 countries practicing apartheid, from competing in the Games, the removal of openly racist International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, and hiring Black coaches to U.S. teams. The potential boycott became a hot topic in the news, and of debate among athletes.
All the Black athletes want to run, but we don't want to close the door on millions of Black people here in the United States.
I don't see a boycott really helping the Negro cause.
In the months leading up to the Games in Mexico City, the OPHR kept members of the press guessing whether they would attend or not.
We will let you know about the future of your Olympic team when we deem it proper and when we feel that you can handle that kind of information. Right now, we just don't think that you're ready.
Tom, when will come a determination whether you, Lee Evans, and others will or will not boycott the Olympics?
I wish I could tell you.
Ultimately, it came down to a vote.
The decision was made that if there wasn't really a kind of unified or the majority of that Black athletes would participate, the boycott would be called off because those who did boycott, like Tommy Smith, would have been boycotting in vain. Another Black person simply would have taken their place.
Even though most of the OPHR's demands remained unmet, the athletes headed to Mexico City with plans to make their own demonstration if the opportunity arose, which it did on October 16th, following the men's 200-meter final. OPHR members Tommy Smith and John Carlos won gold and bronze, respectively, and Smith set a new world record. After the race, they solemnly approached the medal stand, shoeless, wearing black socks, accepted their medals, and just as the U.S. national anthem began to play, did this.
Oh, don't you love the timing? Skip ad.
For the full duration of the Star-Spangled Banner, Smith and Carlos bowed their heads and each raised a black-gloved fist in the air to protest the racial injustice in their home country and show solidarity with those fighting for equality.
I will say I was 9 years old at this time. And then what consciousness does a 9-year-old have? But I remember this because it was headline news.
The fists are not the only symbolic gesture in this image, as Tommy Smith explained later.
The right glove signified the power within Black America. The left glove signified Black unity. The scarf that was worn around my neck signified Blackness. John Carlos and me wore black socks without shoes to also signify our poverty.
Additionally, John Carlos wore his jacket unzipped, a violation of Olympic etiquette to show solidarity with working class Americans. He also wore beads to honor victims of lynching. And finally, all three medal winners, including silver medalist Peter Norman of Australia, wore
buttons reading Olympic Project for Human Rights. There were some boos in the stadium last night.
This moment was the ultimate manifestation of the work of Harry Edwards and the OPHR to intersect outspoken political activism with sport. And it ended Smith and Carlos's Olympics.
When the International Olympic Committee suspended them Friday, their credentials were taken away and they were told they could not stay in Mexico.
They were dropped from the U.S. Olympic team and given 48 hours to leave Mexico. Sports journalist Howard Cosell criticized the U.S. Olympic Committee's decision in this fiery broadcast from Mexico City.
They say the games are sports, not politics, something separate and apart from the realities of life. But the Black athlete says he is a human being before he is an athlete, that he wants equality everywhere, not just within the arena.
Tommy Smith and John Carlos were saying Black athletes don't have it made in American society. We may be famous, but we face the same discrimination that other Black people do. And we don't appreciate being used as a way to counter the Black struggle coming out of Black communities.
And there's the
Black athletes are Black. People have multiple identities. I think Colin Kaepernick is representing a voice in the Black community, which is the same thing I think that Carlos and Smith were saying, that the Black struggle is more than just about integration and assimilation. It's also about empowering this particular community. And people like Tommy Smith, Harry Edwards, John Carlos came from poor Black communities.
Which is why this protest on the Olympic medal stand wasn't just about sports, as Tommy Smith explained to Howard Cosell the next day.
Do you think you represented all Black athletes in doing this?
I can say I represented Black America. I'm very proud to be a Black man and also to have won the gold medal. And this, I thought I could represent my people by letting them know that I'm proud to be a Black man.
So, that was 1968. I told you, when I was a child, I had no social awareness. You know, I was outside playing games. But I do remember that because it became such a big deal. You couldn't avoid the issue. So I want to show you, just so you see how this story comes out, because those athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, are about, 12 years older than I am. And so this is an interview that was done a little while back, where you will see an older athlete talking. So give me 1 second to get this prepared. So this is actually 2019. This is very recent.
It's known as one of the most iconic moments in sports history when two American sprinters raised their black-gloved fists in protest at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Well, now, more than 51 years later, Tommy Smith and John Carlos are being inducted into the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Hall of Fame. CBS News special correspondent James Brown spoke to gold medalist Tommy Smith about this honor.
Tommy Smith's fist was the highest. He had just won the 200-meter gold medal. Right next to him was bronze medalist and teammate John Carlos.
People could not understand. It was not about the flag. It was a chance to heighten the idea that we must eradicate stupidity called racism.
It was a statement through symbolism. The gloved fists represented power.
The head bowed represent prayer or faith. The feet with the pants rolled represented poverty,
one of the most important things was making a statement without saying a word.
The reaction was swift. Smith and Carlos were suspended from the national team and immediately sent home. They were vilified, at one point homeless and unemployed.
Although I had 11 world records, I was washing cars just to feed my son. I couldn't find a job because they viewed me as a radical person who was dangerous.
Smith and Carlos eventually recovered. Both coached and taught in college and high school. Today, at 75 years of age, Smith says his induction into the Olympic Committee Hall of Fame is bittersweet. Is this in some way an admission on the organization's part? We were on the wrong side of history?
I think they begin to see that now. Yes, it was the right thing to do.
While induction is an honor any athlete would treasure, he shared with me a letter that he plans to read at Friday's ceremony. My crime, taking advantage of a moment and a platform to call attention to injustice. A dream long deferred for two courageous young men. James Brown, CBS News, Atlanta.
CBS News special correspondent James Brown joins me now from our Washington bureau. James, it was stirring to listen to you read from Tommie Smith's letter. I'm just wondering if that really scratches the surface on how he feels about this honor, considering how much he and his family, his children, were denied so much for so long.
I think you worded it properly, Errol. It only scratched the surface. And he's a very thoughtful man who really does measure his words. So you can imagine that was probably more the top of the water, where you see more still and calm, if you will, as opposed to the water being more active, regurgitating, if you will, beneath the surface. But a very thought-provoking man who still is quite passionate about his stand and trying to eradicate, as he called it, the stupidity of racism. He's just doing it in a very constructive fashion now.
And just remind for our viewers what was happening in the country at that time and how these protests came about. I mean, 1968 was this pivotal year. You had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of Senator Robert Kennedy. You had global student protests happening as well. What spurred this act?
You know, and the track stars, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, were left to their own devices because the Olympic Project for Human Rights, as conceived by Dr. Harry Edwards, the sociologist there on the West Coast, he was going to be there in Mexico City, but because of threats on his life, he didn't get a chance to organize it the way he wanted to. He stayed back. He was in Montreal, as a matter of fact, and he told the athletes they're on their own to do what they feel best to do. And that's what John Carlos and Tommie Smith came up with, was the black glove, the rolled up pants, if you will, on their pant legs, a shoe off, etc. They wanted the symbolism to speak loudly for what was happening or not happening back here in this country.
Were they surprised or shocked at the backlash and how swift and severe it was?
I believe they were certainly expecting there to be some backlash, but Errol, the degree to which they were vilified and ostracized certainly was very surprising and shocking to them, because it's not as if they were protesting something that was insignificant or benign. It was quite serious. And to see how people reacted was very hurtful and extreme, to the point that, again, as we mentioned in the piece, they were unemployed, homeless for a while, he and John Carlos, but some 51 years later, now it's being recognized that their track accomplishments were extremely worthy of induction 51 years ago.
And we cannot look at what's happened to them without being reminded of what's happened to former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. He kneeled during the national anthem to protest police violence against African Americans and inequality. That was followed by black and white players on and off the field. And while he did settle with the NFL and receive an NFL contract, he wants to play, and he's still not on a team. How does Smith and Carlos feel about Kaepernick needing to do what he does at this time and still facing resistance from none other than the President of the United States?
there is absolutely no way that you can't connect the dots between what was done 51 years ago and today, which speaks volumes about the fact that the issues are still persistent, they're systemic, and they're very hurtful and painful in terms of the impact on the oppressed, if you will. It's just a shame that so many people still see it as a very volatile discussion to have, one that sparks this kind of reaction and essentially hijacking the narrative to say what they are doing, when in fact the aim is that there would be an inclusive discussion across the spectrum to bring a positive answer to what has been a persistent and pernicious problem.
And before we let you go, I mean, it's such a great and rare opportunity to.
So that's as far as I need to go on that. Part of why I wanted to show that to you, so that you understand the athletes of 1968 finally got their due and their honor, but connecting the dots to now, because the problem obviously is what spurred this summer's protests. The commissioner of the NFL, where originally Colin Kaepernick and that whole kneeling protest caused the NFL some embarrassment. The commissioner last summer, because of the protests, finally came out and said, we were wrong. And, without Black players, we have no NFL. And he went on television and said, we were wrong, and Black Lives Matter. So those protests have results. We're still a long way from finishing this issue. But that's, without protest, you wouldn't have it even come to the fore. So that's what I got for you today. Friday, we're going to read from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, because it really does carefully outline his understanding of what is a good law and what is a bad law, and what is a law that is worth resisting. So in all of this, the thing that I really do want to get across is that this is, if anything, this teaches you respect for the law, but not undue respect. Understand it, obey it, and if you're going to oppose anything, do it thoughtfully, strategically, disciplined. And what we're going to do after this week is, are you guys familiar with the term intersectionality? It's one of those big words, but it gets used a lot. Does anybody have a sort of a working definition of it? Try to describe it.
If you're affected by an issue, like that's one thing, and if you have on top of that a different issue you're affected by, those intersect, and you could have even more, you could face even more discrimination, or you have different troubles because you face two different problems at the same time.
That's a partly accurate description, yeah. Think about yourself. Think how many different ways you can look at yourself, right? You have a gender, you have an age, you have a racial identity, you have an economic identity, you will have, especially as you get older, an educational identity, you'll have a career identity or a job identity. All of these different identities exist within you, okay? You have a gender preference identity. All of them call on a certain way to be in the world. And these identities don't always fit perfectly well together. That's our job as adults, to sort of integrate these things. But how you exist in society can be conflicted by these, okay? And the intersections of these identities and social issues outside you, how those intersect, have a lot to do with how you live your life. And so what I'm going to want you guys to do is to imagine yourself having agency, having influence in the world. because I know that you guys aren't voting age yet, but even right now, you have avenues that you could pursue if you wanted to, where you could influence the world or have an influence or participate and meet other people who are like-minded and similarly motivated. So we're going to look at how other people have created organizations, have created institutions that are meant to influence public policy and meant to influence public consciousness, and what you can do, how you can contribute with that. So that's what, to me, the whole point of a class of government is to give you a sense of where you can put your hands on some levers so that you can take action, you can take positive action, should you want to. So that's what we're going to focus on for the last part of the semester. Are there any questions before I let you guys go? Okay. Well, it's been good to see you. Glad that you all made it safely through the break. And we've got, after this week, we've got 4 more weeks left in the semester. So that's the time that we've got together. So unless there's any questions, I'll see you guys on Friday. Okay. So take care, be safe. We'll see y'all later. Okay, bye-bye.